So you just never know where you're going to find a Marketplace Connection speaker. And as he was telling John his story, John's brain was already going, oh, he would be a really good speaker because he has started and sold a couple of software businesses. Not particularly what he set out to do, but what he ended up doing. And so he is here today. He's currently not in the software field because he had a non-compete on his last sale of company. How much longer are you non-competing?
It's October.
Oh, October. So good we have him now because I'm sure he's already thinking about what he's going to launch next. So he will be coming now to share with us. And welcome, Rohan.
Basically, I'm going to talk about lessons I've learned throughout my career. So I'm going to give you a bit of life history. That was me, I think it was, that's 2006, so just over 10 years ago. And we were just getting going with our new product called Metrix, a software product. That's a beach in Australia. As you can hear, I sound funny. I'm not from around here, from the deep south. We had a product called Metrix, and we brought it to the US market. And I actually moved over here in 2011, and we sold the business about 3 years ago. So I'm going to give you a bit of history, if I can work out the clicker, and then talk about the lessons I've learned along the way. I've learned a lot along the way, and I wish they were all really profound lessons. Probably the most profound thing is how ignorant I was when I started. So some of these lessons are just like, of course, but they were valuable to me and life-changing to me along the way, and they changed fundamentally who I am. So that's, I guess, going back to that picture, I've changed on the outside for sure, but on the inside we're all changing, and I guess the crux of what I'm talking about today is that we can take a part in how we change, because we're all changing. We're all going to be different 10 years from now, and we can be proactive about that, or we can let that happen to us. So a bit of my history. So I started in the printing industry in Australia in 1986. I was 18 at the time, and I worked in the printing industry for almost 10 years, and software started to trickle down. I should check what time I'm going till, Pat. 1:20, okay, that's a good time. You sure?
1:15, 1:20.
Okay, that's good. So in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, software started to come down to Australia from the US. This guy named Steve Jobs. You've probably heard of him. Well, before he made these wonderful handy devices, he was starting in the graphic arts industry. And there's a big story about that, about how he was a dropout at Stanford, but hung around the campus and did sat in on calligraphy classes and things like that. And that's why we've got nice fonts on computers today, probably. Yeah, thank you, Steve. And of course that lends itself directly to the printing industry, because the printing industry is all about fonts and reproduction and style and art, as well as information. And so he really started the desktop revolution, and that started changing how print production worked. Before Steve came along, there was machines that were hundreds of thousands of dollars to, if you got an image of a model that had an earring and you wanted to remove that earring, you would have to get in and remove the pixels, change the pixels around. Now, some of you have done that probably at home on your red eye, you click on a button, things like that. Well, it was a minor miracle back in those days, and it cost you big bucks. Steve made it affordable for everybody. In terms of thousands of dollars for a Mac, a laser writer, and all that sort of stuff. So that technology started to come into the printing industry in Australia, and I had what they call an entrepreneurial seizure. Oh, I could make money from this too. And I didn't know anything about software. I didn't know much about business, so hence all the lessons I had to learn, some of them the hard way. I started Holt Software, how's that for an original name, in 1995, and worked on building this product called Superimpose for 4 years. And my first trip to the US, which was the last week of June, the first week of July in 1999, because the internet had happened. And I found some printing companies that had websites in America, and I'd made my program, which only worked in millimetres, I made it work with inches. And I'd also make it work with this other program, this other software program called Preps, that was really big around the world. They'd sold over 20,000 licenses of that in the printing industry. And so I came to America to try to sell Superimpose to people who needed inches, and I wanted to visit this company called Scenic Soft that was based in Linwood, Washington. And I visited them and basically left that building that day with an offer for my business. It wasn't a hard offer yet, but it was a definite offer. John's actually with us today. John Eames was the CFO of Scenic Soft. So I met John back in 1999. That's how easy it is to track our history, our 18 years of history this year. So Scenic Soft offered to buy my business. That was, like I said, the first week of July. Who wouldn't want to come and live in Linwood, Washington in the first week of July? It was gorgeous. So I made multiple trips. I brought my wife over too. We had 2 little children at the time, and we visited Seattle. We went out on Eric's boat. Eric was the owner of the company. He took us out to some gorgeous islands. It's just beautiful. So between July and September, we visited many times. We said, yes, we want to live here. And so we moved over here in November. And and what a shock that was. Oh, by January, I was ready to slit my throat. But anyway, Eric did a job on us with the weather. He timed that perfectly. I don't know how he did that. And we moved over here in November 1999 with our 2-year-old and our 3-year-old, and we started to work with Scenic Soft. So Scenic Soft renamed our product Up Front. It was Superimpose and it became Up Front. And I worked there for 3 years. We moved back to Australia in 2002. Scenic Soft was looking like getting bought, and they were bought by a Canadian company who then were acquired by Kodak. And so I was back in Australia working on a new version of this. I learned a lot at Scenic Soft, and I'm going to go through some of those lessons. I learned that it's not just about software, number one. I thought that I was just thinking about making software, but I learned, you've got to know about sales. You've got to know about business. Especially when you're selling your company, you should know something about business valuation and mergers and acquisitions and all that sort of stuff. You should probably plan your exit before you walk into the building. and a lot. People was another big thing. We didn't have any employees. We had one part-time guy. So looking at how Scenic Soft did things changed everything for me. So we started Metrix in 2002 or 2003. And then I worked on that, having learned a lot of things from Scenic Soft. And that was back in Australia. Then 2011, we moved over here. I had 2 more kids by that time. So we had all 4 kids and my wife and I. And worked here, hired John somewhere in that process again to help me fill in the gaps in my knowledge and expertise. And then sold that company in 2013 to a public company called EFI. And I worked with them for about 18 months, which is about 17 months too long. I'm not a big company guy, I've discovered. Eventually learnt that lesson. Okay, so just to give you an upshot of, or a quick snapshot, of what Metrix does, it's designed for the printing industry, and our real advantage or our real novelty in the printing universe was this thing called ganging. So with the internet, if you buy business cards today, you probably order them somewhere online. You probably put in your credit card, and you might even upload a PDF file or whatever file you want, or you use their online editing to put in what font, what name, and all that sort of stuff. And then what they will do is actually put your product on a press sheet with lots of other products, because in traditional printing, the most expensive part of producing a print job is to set up the press for the sheet. Then you press run, and it runs at sometimes 10,000 sheets an hour, and then you cut them apart. So what we did, and this is after Scenic Soft, and I learned a lot about where the limitations were in existing systems, was write an algorithm that could put all these different orders. You might have 60 or 70 different business cards on a sheet, different quantities of them, things like that, and different sizes perhaps, and with other flyers, work out how to fit them on a sheet. So it could be all set up at once, and we'd do it in about 2 seconds. Where back in the printing industry in Sydney, when I used to do it in the 80s, That would take me hours. And just when you're ready to start to use the film and everything, then someone would say, actually, I want 1,000, I don't want 250, and your whole layout's changing right before your eyes, and you've lost 2 hours of your life, and you'll never get back again. So that's what Metrix did. And then we'd tie that right down through to the pre-press systems to create the plates for the press and things like that. Okay, so lesson 1. How does a non-software person create software? Back in the 90s. So somebody, thankfully, pointed me to Microsoft Visual Basic. And it's around today, Visual Basic, but it's changed. But back in the day, that was the program that a non-programmer could use to write software. So in less than a year, I was selling my first program for more than $10,000 a license, which is pretty cool for less than a year. I don't know if you could do it today. And if somebody had said, oh, you need to get C++ or C#, C++ wasn't around then. Oh, yes, it was. C# wasn't, sorry. But if they'd said something like that, I would have died no one would have ever heard of the software. It would have just been a beautiful dream. But Visual Basic made it possible. So one of the lessons I learned early on was that the right tool for the job makes all the difference in the world. So, a hammer, a screwdriver can get a nail in if you really work hard at it, but a hammer will make it so much easier. So that's something I've learned and I try to stick with. Find the right tool for the job. There's tools out there. There's people that have had your problem and have solved it some way. So you don't have to create everything yourself. Now, what Microsoft Visual Basic wouldn't do for me is it wouldn't run on the Macintosh, which was Steve Jobs' baby. So, as I said, Steve Jobs had a big influence on the printing industry. The Mac is still about 50% of the market out there in the printing industry. Maybe even more now. And of course, I use a Mac now. I don't know about you guys, but they used to be pretty specialised. Now they just work, and I don't like Windows that much. Java is a programming language that would work on the Mac or the PC, or even Linux and things like that, where Visual Basic would not. So one of the things I learned at Cynicsoft, because they had products that had Java components in, they would run cross-platform, and I thought, if I wanted to do this again, I would use something like Java. So we did, and we released only for Windows at first, but by Metrix version 3, with very little extra tweaking, we had it running on the Mac as well. And like I said, it would run on Linux and other operating systems. So again, the right tool for the job, I learned a lot that there's different tools. Java also has an incredible API for doing incredible graphics and things like that. Again, just another tool. With Visual Basic, I had to use third-party things to enable it to do good graphics, and they had problems with them. So it's another thing I learned. Design patterns. This is very geeky stuff, I have to confess. But Design Patterns is a book where there's common problems in programming, and people, very, very smart people, have solved these problems and can reduce the solutions to sort of symbols and methodologies. It's a bit like building construction. You don't have to invent all of this stuff from the ground up. You just have to find out best practices of other people. Again, I didn't know. That's how ignorant I was. I didn't know. I just had to solve everything myself when I first started. But at Cynicsoft, the engineers were often referring to this book like it was the Bible. And I realized, so I bought a copy and I spent enough time in it to really work out, oh wow, that's how you do this. That's how you make something like a word processing software that's actually incredibly complex, but it just works. And that's a good lesson. Another lesson was planning. So I was shooting from the hip all the time. I was, with my software project, how long does it take to write a piece of software? Who knows? You just get started and you just burn the candle at both ends, and sooner or later you're done. Well, I found out when I came to Cynicsoft that there's people like Steve McConnell, who's a local guy, I think, or at least he was 10 years ago. I saw him speak, maybe that's 15 years ago now. Who can teach you how to handle a whole project planning and things like that. Again, I didn't know that you could really do stuff like that. But you really can. One of the other things I learned is that, again, I was obsessed with the technology, as you can see. All the slides I've been showing you now about the technology side. But there's other things involved in business. There's people, there's managing, there's a lot of other stuff that I really wasn't interested in and didn't have a bent towards, but I realised that I needed to. And so Peter Drucker came to my rescue. I can't remember where or who referred me to Peter Drucker. It might have been a friend of a friend or something. But I bought. It must have been a dozen of his books. This one sums it all up. It's the Daily Drucker. You get 365 readings of Drucker. And he talks about what's the purpose for a business and then how you carry that out, managing people, managing yourself. He just put an incredibly valuable perspective on the whole entrepreneurial process. And so I can't speak highly enough about Peter Drucker. He died, I think, probably 10 years ago, but he's incredible, and I highly recommend his stuff. The Bible, obviously, the Bible's got a fair bit of wisdom in it too, apparently. So I actually took to reading Solomon, Proverbs every single day, because there's 31 chapters. That means most months you get through it. Every second month or so you don't read the last chapter, and I could live with that. But Solomon lived about 3,000 years ago, and he's apparently one of the wisest people that ever lived. We all probably know that story about how he asked for wisdom, and because he asked for wisdom and not wealth, he got wealth and wisdom. Also, I've read a bit more recently about how he was the head of Israel at the time of its supreme wealth and influence, and he sent out people and travelled widely. And so apparently the book of Proverbs is Proverbs from other nations as well that he took in. Now, a lot of these were polytheistic nations, but he worked it all out into monotheism. So basically in the book of Proverbs you've got 3,000 plus year old wisdom about life, reason, government, righteousness, justice, evil, all these things, and people. And that's what I needed. So I started reading this daily, and at first it was confusing, and it still can be, but eventually it started making some sense, and I started to realise, that applies to this situation, this business deal, this person, this employee I'm having troubles with. It's amazing the wisdom I got from it over the years. So that was key. Another great one, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie. Can I see a show of hands for who's read that? Or at least, oh yeah, okay, I don't have to tell you about it then. It's awesome stuff. Again, I think of that as like Solomon wisdom in modern day settings and stories, and a really engaging writer. This book, if I had to talk about the books that influenced my second business the most, it was this one for sure. Crossing the Chasm. I'm sure John's heard me mention this many, many times. So Jeff, when I was leaving Scenic-Soft, and I knew I had a plan to compete with Scenic-Soft, so that's a bit of an awkward situation, but I knew I was going to compete with the product that I'd sold them, and that was okay because we didn't have a non-compete. I'm convinced of that, John. And sorry?
I don't think there was.
No, there wasn't. One of the product managers there, Lisa Horwich, suggested this book, and I like Lisa. She was smart, and when I looked at this book, I had no idea that people wrote books about high-tech marketing, about how high-tech adoption goes from, you need early adopters, and then you need the end market, and there's the mass market, the bell curve for technology adoption and all that sort of stuff. Geoffrey Moore and his group had talked to so many software companies over the years and had analysed how all this happens, and it became my core strategy for how we would develop the product. Basically he talks about how if you want to take Europe back from the Nazis, you don't just start fighting them on all fronts. You find a point, Normandy in this case, and you give it everything you've got. You throw everybody at that beach, and a lot of them will become bodies, and it was a terrible moment, but they won back Europe, and from that point, with that beachhead, they could take the whole of Europe back. That's history. Well, same with technology. People like me, I wanted to spray bullets around everywhere and hope for the best, and I'd do a bit of this and a bit of that, and I was I had nobody's full solution, but I had a little bit of this and a little bit of that, listening to people's requests. So after reading this book, I decided, no, we're going to focus on one market, and it was that ganging market, the idea of putting different products on a sheet, which wasn't a well-known market, but it was becoming a well-known market. And sure enough, we became the number one software for that solution. That put us on the map. Then when you are the leader, in any sort of sphere, that gives you an opportunity to grow into other spheres. And if it wasn't for this book, I wouldn't have chosen that narrow of a strategy. He also talked about how, based on where you are in the adoption curve, you need to change your pricing. So those first guys, those technology adoption propeller heads, you know what I mean, they're looking for any technology. They will pay big bucks for it. But the later in the mass market, you need to have standardised pricing. It needs to be as low as you can afford it, and you need to make the money out from volume. And all these things were so well explained and so thought out. The strategy of partners. So Microsoft did this. They didn't have any networking technology in their early Windows, so they built in other people. I think it was Nortel Networks, and I've forgotten some of the names, and that's, I guess, the moral of the story is you forget those names. People like Microsoft build other people's technology in it first to provide the product to the consumer to gain the market share, and then they, at their leisure, build out those partners and take it all. And there's great business strategies that are proven that I had no idea about. So this book was absolutely key to marketing, selling, pricing, different channels, and made a huge difference. Then competing with Kodak was a little daunting because they're Kodak, and Kodak sales guys are all in black suits. I mean, they're daunting, and. But this guy, Clayton Christensen, who was head of Harvard Business School, he wrote this book about the innovator's dilemma. And he talked about how hard it is for big companies to build truly innovative solutions, because they've got such a hierarchical structure that most of the middle management are mainly concerned about keeping their jobs. You know, they make good money, and they go home at night and forget about the business, and so for them to innovate is actually a bit risky. And so there was an old saying back in the day that nobody gets fired for buying IBM. So in other words, you just buy the big brand names if you're a middle management, and you pretend you've done your diligence, and you keep your head down. You don't stick it out. Innovation, however, is risky, and but that's the stuff for us little guys. And I knew that being an Australian number one, a company in Australia competing against Kodak, and having relatively no money, we better innovate, or why would anybody buy a product of us? So this guy helped me understand their problems with innovation and helped me continue to exploit what we could do, which was out-innovate Kodak in our domain. Brilliant stuff. He also wrote, just a follow-up to the innovative solution, so he actually analysed it enough and worked out how big companies like Kodak and Agfa and Heidelberg, all these guys we were competing with, how they could actually bring innovation in. Thankfully, most of our competitors didn't read it, but it was... but it's a good book too. Then this comes to the other side, the negotiation side and the business side of things. So selling to Cynicsoft, after that I reflected on that deal at my leisure for many years and realised, I don't think I did a great job with that deal. And so I better learn some stuff. So Negotiating with Giants was an interesting book to give me, again, an insight into how a big company thinks. And this became very important for when I sold my second enterprise to a public company, bigger than Cynicsoft was. And I got an understanding, again, that they couldn't innovate. They tried to bluff me, and if I've got time, I'll tell you about some of the offers that they made from a business and some of the trials I had over the years. But when I realised how hard it was for a large company to innovate, I realised that the stuff we had was actually much more valuable to them than just the money itself. Sell Your Business Your Way, again, another example of a book that helped me get inside the mind of the buyer. And then this one here was full of numbers. It was sort of like John's sort of domain, the CFO type perspective on life. But it was important for me to get that and to try to understand how they would value the company and stuff like that. So even though I could never go into detail and teach about this sort of stuff, it was important for me to get enough in my head. This one was pretty critical. Who's heard of this one? Getting to Yes. Okay. So it's a great, again, Harvard Business School, I think, put this out, and talks about different forms of negotiation. I read a couple of books on negotiation, and again, made a big difference to my ability to get a much better deal the second time round. So, actually, before I go into that, I am going to talk about a couple, because I've got a few minutes. I'm going to talk about a couple of the lessons I learned from the offers made for my businesses over the years. So, there was 6 offers, really, of any substance. So when I first started my software product, and I started showing it, so this is back in the 90s now, started showing it to printing companies in Australia. There was a New Zealand software company that was like a management system that would run the whole printing company they were coming from New Zealand, but they were making a big splash in Sydney, and they heard about our software. And so I got a phone call from the managing director one day saying, I've heard you've been seeing this printing company, come and see me. And so I sat there, and there was a big trade show. The first trade show we ever did was in May 96, and so it was just prior to, it would have been about December 95. And he said, I've heard good things, Rohan, and I like what you're doing with the software, but you need to come with us, and he gave me the pitch, and I think he offered me maybe 1% of his business. And here's the good, he said, but if you don't do it, we're going to beat you to it, and you're going to be history, sort of thing. And it was daunting. I mean, I had never done even a single trade show. This is our first year. I was making cool software with Visual Basic. It enabled me to get there, but I didn't know what I'm doing yet. I hadn't learned all these lessons yet. And I got this big guy who's running a multi-million-dollar business who's basically saying, join us or we'll kill you. And so I went home and I thought long and hard and prayed long and hard about that. And thankfully, this little voice said, I don't think he can do it. And he could write management information systems where you put data in and you get reports and you get your finances tracked. But what I was doing, that sort of fitting and ganging sort of stuff, and we weren't doing that in the early days, but we were doing layouts. It's pretty technical. I had spent 10 years in the printing industry becoming an expert. So just something in my gut said, I don't think he can do it. So I just said, no. Thank you, no. And anyway, next at the trade show, we had our trade stand. I had my brother and my childhood friend on the stand because I couldn't afford anybody else. And sure enough, this guy comes over on the first day of the stand, and he comes over with his cronies, and he says, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay. And he says, Rohan, as I told you, there's a button in our software interface that says imposition on it. And that's what we did, imposition. And he goes, but when we press it, nothing happens. So I need to talk, and we need to talk. And it's like, phew. So anyway, it paid off. He couldn't do it. It was beyond their expertise, their domain experience, and I ducked that. So my lesson there was you've got to listen to your gut, and you've got to be careful of a threat. Is it reality or not? And in that case, I gambled that it wasn't a real threat. It was a perception of a threat, but it wasn't real. Soon after that, we visited one of the biggest printing companies in Australia. And these big companies, they have their own software divisions, even though they're a printing company, because they do stuff. They liked what we were doing, and I got called into the office to talk to the general manager, who was had a software division. And he said, Rohan, we like what you're doing, but we want to own it. And I said, oh, okay. He says, I'll give you $100,000. And it was like, and then I said, thank you for the offer. I'll tell you, let me talk about it with, let me think about it, talk about it with my wife. I'm a one-man show, my wife's pretty important. Then he says, oh, okay, you talk to your wife and I'll talk to mine and we'll see what they can come up with. And then, so my next lesson is, if somebody's going to insult you to your face, then it's probably not best to get into bed with them. So I decided, no, thank you, and I went, and I never looked back. There was, it was interesting, the idea of working for a big company that would insult you as they're making an offer for you. Then the next offer was CynicSoft, the one that I ended up taking. So now that was a different deal, and it involved moving here. And probably one of the key things for that was, by that point, 99, my marriage was pretty strained. So I had become obsessed with technology, and I had, like I said, 2 little kids, And thankfully, my wife absolutely demanded that I be at the dinner table at 6 o'clock every night, because if she hadn't, I don't think I would have seen the kids grow up at all. I say to my shame. But thankfully for her putting her foot down there, that I kept enough of a relationship. But still, when Cynicsoft came around, it was a chance for us to sell, to move to America and to have a normal job, if you like. And I promised, and my wife said, I am not going to America with you if you are going to work as hard as you are now. And I get it. And I said to her, there's no way I'm selling for that. I will be home for dinner at 6 and I will not go back to work. And I kept my promise, and within 2 weeks of moving over here and doing that and keeping my promise, she started talking about having another baby. So I think it worked, and I think it saved my marriage. It was an interesting lesson. One of the biggest lessons I learned, that you can see from the books I read later, is that I didn't plan that exit. So I don't think I did a great deal, because I was just focused on the software, not the people, not the deal, not the negotiation, not the business, not the sales channels, but I learned all of that at Cynicsoft. Okay, the next three offers were all from EFI, the company I ended up selling to. So I'd started Metrix in Australia and had started showing some of these big company guys what I was doing. And they dragged me into a room at a trade show and they said, we like what you're doing. We'll give you $500,000. And I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And I had a moment of truth where I realised, you know what, that would really help financially. But I'm not finished with this vision. I've only started. And I realised then that the money, it wasn't all about money. It was about this vision. And you sometimes don't realise that until you've got the option there. And I said, no. And he goes, all right, $1 million. And then I thought, this is going good. This is the right direction. And I said, and then he says, and that's my last offer. That's all I'm authorised to do. So I said, I'll think about it. But thinking about it, I realised it's not just about the money. The money's important and necessary, but this is about a vision for me, a project I've got to complete. Years later, so I said no, and they went away. Years later, they were nibbling at me again, and they wanted to do a deal that was an all earn-out deal, no cash. And that's when I really learnt. Because one of the things I did sell for Cynicsoft with was some stock options, which all ended up being worthless. Welcome to the 90s, .com bust. So I learned with that second round that I needed some control, and to lose your control over something costs something. Your promises isn't going to do it for me anymore. And knowing what I know now, I would have done a lot of things differently about those sorts of things. Finally, the last offer came, and it wasn't as sweet as you hope. We all love our baby. Our baby is the most beautiful baby in the world, but other people just see it as a baby, And but the real deal, it came down to there's an opportunity to get out. Sometimes, really what it came down to is somebody said you can't sell a company, but a company can be bought. And there's some truth to that if you think about it. That I had tried to get out. John can tell you that I'd planned to get out for a while, but you can't just, as soon as you go knocking on doors, the price of your business goes down. So you can't just click your fingers and get out. You've got to plan that exit, and you've got to pray and hope. And when an opportunity does come, then there's sometimes it's the right time to take it. So I took it, and I'm glad I did. I did hold out fairly well. I think I did pretty good in that deal. And I guess, and that's probably one of the big upshots too, is that I planned that if I was going to get out, I wasn't going to have any regrets. I was going to build a sustainable business, which meant that I could take it or leave it. And that's what this book really taught. It talks in negotiation. Anybody who's read it will remember the BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So when you're, especially in negotiations with a more powerful company, you've got to be able to walk. And if you had done what I did the first time around, which was stretch my marriage to breaking point, then your ability to walk is pretty limited, because everything's at its wit's end at that point. But with the second time round, I built it much stronger, so we could survive and actually enjoy ourselves, have a sustainable business with employees that actually I think liked coming to work. Yeah, John? Good. And so building it for the long haul made a big difference. Meant that I could walk and I could hold out for a higher price and did better. So, just to wrap up, when I had sold to EFI and I was still working with them and not enjoying the big company experience, I was contemplating my options, but I felt reluctant to let go of that baby that had been so important to me. And I got an email from Canlis, the restaurant here. I must have given them my email address somewhere along the line. And Brian Canlis said this: if what we are doing is not aligned with who we want to become, it's time to do something different. And that just like hit me in the face. That I was being a big company guy, trying to be a middle manager, and I was getting paid well for it and stuff, but it wasn't, I didn't want to become that. I was filling in now, I was paying the bills, and that really was the impetus to quit and to get on with the next stage of my life. So I think, again, we make choices every day about who we're becoming, and we can do that on our own, or we can get the best of all the research, all the books out there, which is what I would recommend. But you have to, I think, bring some deliberateness to who you're becoming, because we're all becoming somebody new. And if you don't think about it, life just happens, and we all know about people who basically lose their soul on the process because they don't put enough effort or energy there. They're looking at other forms of success, and the real form, internal success is something they neglect. That reminds me of a scripture: a good name is to be more desired than great wealth. Favour is better than silver and gold. And a good name, I think that Solomon, having read this a lot now, I think he's not just talking about in the media. People, there's a lot of noise out there and a lot of fake news, and you can make somebody have a good name when they really don't. I think of it as actually a genuine reputation, actually who you are as a person. So who you are and who you are becoming is actually more important than all the other things, the gold, the silver, the wealth. It's good to feed your family, but you can do it without losing your integrity or without remaining ignorant in areas you don't need to. And that's part of my journey, and that's my story. Thank you.